And with that, we will get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. My name, for all of you who don't know, is Erin Collins. I serve as the program director for the Peaceful Presence Project. And so let me share my screen and just give you a brief overview of our organization so that you can get an idea of where we're coming from. So the Peaceful Presence Project is, for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are based in Bend, Oregon. And our mission is reimagining the way that we talk about, plan for, and experience the last stage of life. And we believe that includes serious and terminal illness. Our work is based on the Compassionate Communities model of care, which really surrounds individuals with advanced illness with a variety of caring circles, not just healthcare, but community members as well. Our program areas really fulfill this belief that equitable and compassionate end-of-life care is a human right. We provide education similar to these community education workshops. We offer clinician education in serious illness conversations, end-of-life care. We also offer, just families education. We offer community service providers education about how best to support individuals as they face serious and terminal illness. Our second main program area is the planning that is involved around living with serious and terminal illness. So we do a lot of work in the community to make sure that everybody has access to planning resources, whether they have the ability to pay or not, whether they are sustainably and comfortably housed or not. And really believe that that's a key component to that equitable, compassionate, and informed end-of-life experiences. And then finally, we offer compassionate presence. We have an end-of-life doula program where we support individuals who, whether they're living alone and in isolation or with a vast community resource support group, we support from diagnosis through end of life and beyond. So to circle back to our education, I'm going to actually go over to Angelique, who's going to introduce our panel for this evening, and then I'll come back and let you all know about just an overview. So I'm going to pause my share here. Let me stop. Angelique Lascar is a board member for the Peaceful Presence Project, and she will introduce the panel and the topic for this evening. Angelique?
All right, thanks, Erin. So I think that many of the people on the call know that in November 2020, Oregonians voted to adopt Measure 109, which made psilocybin therapy legal under Oregon law, and we're the first state to do this. Specifically, it allowed for the manufacture, the delivery, and the administration of psilocybin at supervised and licensed facilities. And that law goes into effect January of next year. So today we're going to hear from 4 amazing people who are all working on different aspects of this new law and the program in Oregon. I'm really thrilled to introduce them. So Erin already introduced herself. She's going to be sharing an overview of what is psilocybin, along with their research, and especially research in depression and anxiety at the end of life. Next, we'll be hearing about the legal piece of this from Catherine Tucker, who has been a leader in advocacy efforts to protect and expand the rights of people living with a terminal illness. If Catherine's name sounds familiar, it's probably because she served as the director of advocacy and legal affairs for Compassion and Choices for over 20 years. Today, she's special counsel with Emerge Law Group. She also serves as co-chair of their psychedelics practice group, and she's a founding board member of the Psychedelic Bar Association. So recently, she's been very focused on opening up access to psilocybin therapy, including her work on Measure 109, and also work on ensuring access through state and federal right to try laws. And she'll be sharing more about both of those with us. Our next panelist is Steph Bars, who's a board certified family nurse practitioner and psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. Steph has worked as a nonprofit hospice and palliative care nurse for nearly 20 years, and she currently serves on the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board. And that group is in the process of making recommendations on requirements, specifications, and guidelines for providing these services. So translating that law into an actual program. And then our final panelist tonight is Ladybird Morgan. Ladybird has over 20 years of experience in hospice and palliative medicine and is the co-founder of the Humane Prison Hospice Project. And many of you may have heard about that. It's based in the Bay Area. Ladybird does a lot of work in the area of trauma, and currently she's serving as a co-investigator and study therapist with a really interesting study out of the University of Washington that's looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for psychotherapy for healthcare providers. So we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions as we go along, please go ahead and put those in the chat box. And then let's go ahead and get started. So Erin, give us an overview of what is psilocybin and how does it work in people who are experiencing anxiety and depression at the end of life?
Thanks, Angelique. I'll share my screen once again. So psilocybin, we didn't want to assume that everybody who showed up knew exactly what psilocybin is, so wanted to give a very brief, high-level view so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. Psilocybin is in the classification of psychedelic medicine, and psychedelics are either plant-based or synthetic-based. Plants that are considered psychedelic medicine include, this is not a comprehensive list, but include psilocybin from a variety of mushrooms, ayahuasca, peyote, cannabis is considered a plant medicine as well. Synthetics are things like LSD, MDMA, and I think over 200 different classifications of synthetic psychedelic medicine that has been studied. And as mentioned, as I said, the ayahuasca, psilocybin, and peyote are some of the plant medicines. These medicines have been used for thousands of years by indigenous populations. Shamans in these various populations use them either to see or kind of diagnose an illness or heal someone from an illness. Shamans are respected and known members of their tribes, and were often turned to, or still are often turned to, for the healing with these medicines. And over time, as we all are hopefully aware, colonization has led to appropriation of these medicines for research. And in that process, the indigenous experts have largely been left out. So, in this kind of discovery of these medicines, we've now kind of come to this point, and that started in the 50s and 60s with research that really left these experts or these original users of the medicine out of the process. And so we want to acknowledge that as we talk about psilocybin therapy, it really is in this modern context and without a lot of basis in the cultural uses from previous tribes and use. And Elizabeth, I think, has this link for you if you're interested in learning more about the historical uses and this evolution of these medicines. There's a great journal article that Elizabeth will pop into the chat to share with you about that. So, as I mentioned, in the 50s and 60s, these medicines, some of these medicines were discovered, and really it was the synthetic, mainly the synthetic psychedelic medicines that were discovered. Some of you may be familiar with the studies that happened at Harvard with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who was later known as Ram Dass, and Timothy Leary's famous line of "turn on, tune in, and drop out." Right? These studies and the medicine, LSD in particular, really became associated with the hippie movement. these early studies, and actually both Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, or Ram Dass, were both fired from Harvard for their experiments with students using LSD. The thing that when we look back at those studies, they really weren't methodological. They were flawed, and there were some ethical challenges with that. But the other thing to note is that in this time frame, the 60s and 70s and early 80s, was the same time frame that the modern hospice movement was evolving. And so, from a lot of different perspectives, people were looking at how do we make people more comfortable? How do we work to help people with existential distress? The studies at Harvard were really from a psychotherapy perspective, not necessarily end of life. So the second wave of research, after those early studies happened, LSD in particular became a Schedule I medication. It became illegal. And most studies were completely put on hold. The second wave of research picked up in the early 2000s. And right now, I will say that psilocybin is hot, so to speak. There are currently 41 active clinical trials on psilocybin, using psilocybin and looking at changes in perception. Most of these look at depression, anxiety, PTSD, and studies that are looking at its use for the end of life. So, in looking at some systematic reviews of all these studies from this second wave from the early 2000s to now, specifically looking at studies that focus on end of life or cancer-related distress, some of the findings in these studies, compared to placebos, the physical effects are decreased pain, improved sleep. Psychological effects have shown decreased emotional and cancer-related distress, decreased anxiety, depression, and fear. And on a spiritual and existential level, they're shown a decreased fear of death, increased acceptance and surrender, and decreased hopelessness. And I know that some of the other panelists will talk a little bit more about this. And I want also to bring our attention to who is facilitating these experiences. And Lady Bird will talk about this a little bit more later. But looking that we really are paying attention these days to who the facilitator is and how they're trained, what experiences they have had with psychedelic medicines. Remember the indigenous shamans that are experienced with these medicines, and because they have experience with the medicines and know how they work and are trusted and have long relationships with their community members, really sets people up for a different experience and a different outcome with the medicines. So that the experience as a healer really is dependent on personal experience as well. It's not just about being a good listener, so to speak. And then finally, I just want to talk about what are the things that come up? Many of you may already recognize and know the things that come up at the end of life. But we're going to talk tonight about pain, spiritual and existential distress, what it looks like to have psilocybin as an opening to the experience of life and death, maybe not being separate. I also want to talk about our healthcare providers who, as we all know, after the last 2 years, the burnout, the moral distress that was already present for our healthcare workers was exacerbated by COVID-19. They have had experienced more death and dying than they probably ever thought they would. There's more burnout, or, I should say that there was burnout prior, but it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. Greater existential distress, exhaustion, and moral injury. And Elizabeth will share a link to an article in The Atlantic about this that was actually published in November of 2020 when we were in the third wave of COVID. And so I invite you to check that out to have an understanding of what healthcare providers are experiencing, what they were experiencing 2 years ago, and how that might have expanded or exacerbated even more today. So I'll stop my screen and pass it back to Angelique to start our panel discussion.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. And that was a really great summary. And I think for anyone who's interested in going a little bit deeper on the history of it, I'm not sure if the other panelists have read the Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind. So it's a really good overview of the history of psychedelics, some of the research, et cetera. So if what Erin talked about piqued your interest, that's a good one. And I'll put that in the chat box in just a minute. Great. So let's turn to Catherine now. Can you tell us a little bit about the legal part of this? So how did this law come about in Oregon? What does it allow for, and specifically around end of life? And also, what are its limitations?
Yeah, thanks so much. And hello, everyone. Yeah, so I want to echo a little bit what Erin shared about the benefits of psilocybin-assisted therapy for people with advanced illness. The studies all show, and I have this memorized as sort of a mantra because it's so powerful, immediate, substantial, and sustained relief. And I remember when I first was reading these clinical trial reports of immediate, substantial, and sustained relief, and I thought, that is so compelling. We need to find a way to remove barriers to access. And of course, the barrier to access is that psilocybin sits on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, meaning it is not accessible for anything other than research. And so that's a big barrier. Because of these studies and these findings, there's a lot of excitement about removing barriers. And I'll be talking about that in a moment. But I also want to say what I see as having spent 35 years in advocacy to protect and expand the rights of terminally ill patients. I think we've made a lot of progress around improving end-of-life care, ensuring that patients have a lot of choices, ensuring that pain and symptom management is more readily available, is attentive and aggressive. All of those strides in my 35 years have been really remarkable and positive. But there has been a notable gap in the palliative care toolbox, and that is around relief of non-physical suffering. So when these studies were coming out and showing here's a new tool to address that gap, I think that's what's so exciting. And particularly in Oregon, which of course was also a pioneer with regard to aid in dying. Oregon's Death with Dignity Act was passed in 1994. I'm so old that I was involved in that campaign. And it does empower dying patients with an additional end-of-life choice. Pretty much every stakeholder in the debate about aid in dying is in agreement that no patient should choose that for lack of good palliative care. And so it's so important to imagine this new palliative care tool being available in that palliative care toolbox. So Oregon, once again, now through Measure 109, which is now known as the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, is again a pioneer. It's the first state legal program for access to psilocybin in the nation. So it's being very closely watched. It had a 2-year implementation program, and I know Steph, who serves on the Psilocybin Advisory Board, will talk about that. So there's been a lot of really careful process around how to make sure the program is successful and safe. And so it begins implementation in January 2023, which is really, right around the corner. Now, one of the things to know, of course, about the Oregon law is it can only change Oregon law. it cannot change federal law. And so the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act creates a legal and heavily regulatory program for accessing psilocybin services in the state. All of that activity will be and will remain federally prohibited. So this is an important thing to know. And many of you, since we are here with the host, the Peaceful Presence Project, many of you may be involved with hospice services. And hospice, of course, is normally a federal program. And, you know, patients who are receiving hospice care are receiving care from healthcare professionals of various statuses, but it's all under a federal umbrella. This will not be possible under the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act unless a safe harbor is created for federal exposure. And so that piece of this is something that I'm also working on in a really interesting advocacy effort that some of you may have been following, because there are already duly enacted laws, both state and federal, that are intended to allow patients with advanced illness to access investigational drugs that have completed a phase 1 clinical trial and remain under investigation. Those laws are called right to try. So we embarked into an advocacy effort to compel the DEA to create a pathway to access to psilocybin for patients with advanced illness under state and federal right to try laws. That case has been in the federal courts. It's known as Ames versus DEA. A lot of this information is up on my law firm website blog, Emerge Law Group, on the blog, where all of the developments in the case I've blogged about and include links to the pertinent underlying documents. That effort, if successful, would create a federal safe harbor so that this care to patients with advanced illness, psilocybin-assisted therapy, could be provided by healthcare providers. As you may know, the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act does not require the facilitator to have any education beyond a high school diploma and a module of training that the OHA is determining the content of right now. But many of you who care for patients with advanced illness may be scratching your head and thinking, well, the patients that I see are medically complex and fragile, and really is a high school graduate with no advanced training in care for this population the right provider? So it would be optimum if we can create the federal safe harbor that is intended by the Right to Try Act. There's also a website called righttotrypsilocybin.com, which went up fairly recently, that relates to this effort, and you can find some more information about that, and you can always reach out to me at Emerge as well. But we hope very much to be able to open that pathway to access, so that, you know, those of you who hold DEA registrations, for example, who might worry about your DEA registration being suspended or revoked for involvement with the Psilocybin Services Act, that you shouldn't have to have that fear. So that's kind of just a short overview, but it is a really exciting time. And, you know, certainly, even if the right to try pathway isn't established come January, you will be able to refer your patients with advanced illness to facilitators who are willing to practice under just the Oregon Safe Harbor, even if that isn't sufficient, or you wouldn't feel safe doing so. And your patients can still receive the benefit of psilocybin-assisted therapy. So I think I'll stop there, Angelique, and send it back to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Katie, or Catherine, who also goes by Katie. Great. So let's hear from Steph next. So where are we in terms of implementing this program, since you sit on the advisory board that is advising the Oregon Health Authority, which will be overseeing this? Where are we right now in terms of implementation? And for anyone who's listening in tonight, what does this mean for them if they would like to try the therapy themselves, or if they would like to become a facilitator? How do they go about doing that?
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you all and talking about this today. It is exciting times. There's a lot happening. And, you know, in general, KT hit on a lot of important points, but the advisory board is making the recommendation to OHA, and they're in the process any day, by the end of May for sure, to release the official first set of rules, determining what the training programs will look like, what products and then testing entail. And so just an overview, the board makes recommendations, OHA actually turns things into rules, and there's some really specific aspects to this that some people are aware of and some people aren't, but essentially, the OHA and the whole setup is going to be determined by, you have to, if you want to do psilocybin, it has to take place in a licensed service center. And the facilitators have to be, actually go through a training program. OHA will approve these training programs. A facilitator will need to go through, we're not 100% sure what's going to look like, probably around 160 hours in total, and then take a test and then apply for licensure to become an Oregon licensed facilitator. And then in addition, the actual psilocybin will be grown by licensed growers or manufacturers. Probably, well, it will be limited to one species of psilocybin, the Psilocybe cubensis. Likely, though, in a couple different varieties, there'll be whole mushrooms, homogenized mushrooms, probably some mushrooms in food products, and then extracts, which are different than synthetic. And you can actually, the research that's been going on with psilocybin to date is mostly done with the synthetic psilocybin, but in Oregon, you won't have access, at least unless there's a change in law, to have synthetic. So that's all. Likely, there already are a number of training programs that are setting up shop. They don't know exactly what OHA will say are the specific rules that have to be taught, or sorry, the specific aspects of the training program, but soon we'll know. And I imagine soon people will start to be able to apply to these various programs. Some programs will be for people who are already licensed, so licensed therapists and physicians and counselors. And then there will be programs also that accept other health ally persons. So, and you know what, today I am speaking as really just another human being and a nurse and a nurse practitioner, and not in an official capacity as a board member, but it's a lot going on. And, you know, one of the things that 109 does, and it does a lot, but it doesn't do well, is really, how do we care for our folks who we really are interested in serving? People who are terminally ill, have advanced illness, and may not be able to leave their homes. So all of this, the administration of psilocybin will have to happen in a service center. You won't be able to go to a store and get it and take it home. And some of our folks simply can't either travel or certainly spend hour after hour in this service center. And, you know, there's a problem with that. And they're really, you know, there's perhaps a little bit of discrimination, limited access for that population. I do think some of the other states are learning already from what Oregon is doing and writing some legislation that actually includes potentially serving people who can't leave their home, people with disabilities. So there's probably a lot of questions. I'm excited to get to the question and answer period and really engage with everybody. You know, want to just speak briefly, and I know I have limited time, but I also want to acknowledge, well, there's a, a lot going on. I think there's a lot of good research. Mention that this is, there's lots of books and lots of research, and I think everybody's probably getting feeds all the time about how great psychedelics are. There's some risk, and my bias is I am a clinician. I have a DEA. I am concerned about the population that is medically complex. It tends to take a lot of medications that may be frail, that may have metabolic issues, and probably some degree already of psychological distress. And psilocybin generally is safe. It's not addicting. There may be a little bit of tolerance that builds up that tends to go away. The physiological effects, unwanted effects, nausea, maybe dizziness, that tend to be time limited. But there's a spectrum. Some people don't have any. Some people have quite a bit. But I do want to acknowledge that this is probably for a smaller population, and really, sorry about speaking in acronyms. I'll try to be more clear. Part of the process, I think, of the screening is who is a good candidate for using psilocybin, and that part of the measure it mandates that there is a prep session, and that can happen. It probably will be able to happen online or on the phone. It won't necessarily happen in person. Obviously, the administration session will happen in person, and then the measure will recommend that we offer an integration session, a follow-up session, a making meaning session, but that won't be required, so people can take that. Certainly there may be people who practice and offer a whole lot of other services, a lot more integration, a lot more therapy, but that's the minimum of the measure. I think I'll give my time up for now, and maybe we can talk more about some of those risks and benefits and how psilocybin works a little bit later.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. And just to clarify, so somebody who is interested in receiving psilocybin therapy does not need a referral from a mental health professional, a clinician. They just need to they will just contact one of the licensed centers.
Yeah, there will be a screening process of some sort that happens. Again, we made recommendations. I don't know what OHA will determine, but there will be some type of screening, which is important. And I think a more rigorous and more thorough screening in some cases, particularly for people with advanced illness, is necessary. But if someone's interested in participating, they would contact a service center, and there will be likely every service center will manage their business a little differently in how they get information to clients, how they share what they do, and different services centers. There will be some there'll be some resorts. I'm already hearing about people buying land outside of Bend and in Ashland, and it will be pretty expensive, I imagine. And part of the measure is really paying attention to how do we continue to make this equitable and accessible. And it's a challenge. I think it will be a relatively expensive process. And I don't know, I think people are trying to be creative in how to get the product to people, to everybody, to make it accessible, but there's still a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. Which is why we have a wonderful advisory board advising the Oregon Health Authority. Great.
And subcommittee members too. I do acknowledge.
Yes. Thanks, Steph. So Ladybird, can you tell us a little bit about the research that you've been participating in at the University of Washington?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I'm so intrigued by all of what Catherine and Stephanie are talking about. I have a lot of questions too, but I'll let the guests ask their questions. I've been involved in a study at the University of Washington that was specifically created for clinicians working on the front lines of the COVID experience, to see if psilocybin with we don't call it therapy, but with pre and post-integration sessions actually makes a difference for their distress that they had based on specifically their time working with COVID, not that they had depression before. There's a lot of screening for this group. They can't be on antidepressants right now or have been like really struggling before, and then all of a sudden it got worse. It's that they were actually doing okay, then this happened and they weren't able to climb out of it. And what we're seeing is a lot of just the immense distress, actually. Clinicians who are just overwhelmed with the suffering that they worked with and the amount of death that they worked with. And then also just the political landscape and the environmental landscape of what they walked into when they left the hospitals or the clinics, and managing that as well. So it's not even just one element of, oh, illness was happening and how do we process that, but it's pretty complex, which is perfect for psilocybin. So that's the study I've been working with. And my involvement with this work, as I'm down in California, is really, I'm much more interested in what happens with the facilitation and the facilitators and how this gets rolled out in a good way. The early shamans that you spoke of, Erin, that early shaman was actually a female, Maria Sabina, and she was, basically ousted from her community when she started sharing this medicine work. And what I tend to think about with practitioners and facilitators is that shamans were trained not just to offer us medicine, but they actually were trained to work with it through themselves, and not even just taking the psilocybin, but doing their own personal work and development. And when I think about end of life and the folks that I've trained to sit with people at end of life, it's not just like you were saying, Erin, about listening or understanding what it's like to let go of things, or that you've had death in your life. But when you open up the territory that psilocybin opens up, which is a complex realm of distress and grief and suffering and joy and beauty and a leaving of that, but it's a both and to be able to hold that container is unique. It doesn't need to be every single person in the world that has the license to offer psilocybin to people who are struggling. And so I hope that in these measures that are happening in Oregon, that people really slow down a little bit and realize, okay, we don't need to have 10,000 people offering this, and what are they offering and how are they holding that? And that's kind of where my mind is going now. And so I've done some training at MAPS, and I'm working with Tony Bach up in Seattle around the curriculum that we use there for the facilitators. And it's a lot more about what's happening with the facilitators. And my dream is that while we're waiting for open access for more people to have it, is that actually clinicians are practicing, that clinicians are expanding their capacity to work with suffering and complex emotional situations, and not so much of a focus on giving a magic pill to people who are suffering. I think if we can expand our ability to work with it, then we don't actually need as many people to take psilocybin, because we're already holding a larger capacity. And so I hope we don't just get totally focused on making sure everybody has access to psychedelics, but that we actually realize what is the power of this medicine and how can we use it to actually evolve as a species and as a culture, not just symptom management. So that's my stump speech.
It's wonderful, and it's really exciting. That's great. I think we're on to questions now. So Erin or Elizabeth, I know there have been several in the chat box.
Let's see here. We can go back to a couple of them were answered, but I'm going to say them out loud just so that if anybody wasn't watching. I know that somebody asked what other states are considering legalizing psilocybin for end-of-life care. And Catherine, I see that you put in Colorado, Maine, Hawaii, and others. Is there anything else you want to say about that, about what's happening in other states that you know of?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would say there's just this tremendous excitement that's bubbling up in a very grassroots way. I mean, you may be aware that even before Oregon passed its state law, there had been municipal measures around the country. I think Denver was the first, but now we've seen things from Ann Arbor to Santa Cruz, to Cambridge. There are many municipal enactments where the decriminalization has been achieved. And of course, decriminalization is different than legalization. So I want to disambiguate that. But there had been, and there continues to be, a lot of excitement in these municipal measures. The state measures have included decriminalization proposals and legalization proposals. I've been focusing my efforts on the legalization provisions because I typically focus my work on how do we serve patients with advanced illness, and most people who are terminally ill are not interested in stepping outside the bounds of the law. The decriminalization measures just make it the lowest law enforcement priority, meaning your risk of being arrested and prosecuted is diminished. The legalization measures make it actually affirmatively legal to be involved with this substance. And so I've been focused on those. And so, yeah, there are measures. There was a measure proposed in Washington, and I really appreciate Steph mentioning that the Washington measure, which did not move forward, but it was an interesting measure that included a particular improvement over the Oregon enactment, and that was to address the needs of patients whose illness is so advanced that leaving home to visit a facilitation center would not be either possible or optimum. And so that is a disability rights issue. And in the Washington proposal, there was a provision for service at home if the patient's condition necessitated that. I think that's an important next generation improvement, and we are seeing it in some of these other measures. With regard to Oregon, I think that disability barrier for patients with that kind of advanced illness needs to be addressed either through a modest legislative tweak or a disability litigation where the court mandates that there be reasonable modification of the program to accommodate that population. And so I'm very interested in that, and have been taking a deep dive into how to make sure that that population is served.
Thank you, Catherine. And thanks for all you continue to do for people to have the right to try, and kind of increasing access for everyone. We appreciate all you've done all these years. There's another question, and I think, Steph, maybe what comes up for me around this, it just says, will the service centers be geographically placed, and how many will there be? And I'm wondering if the advisory board has anything to do with the actual service centers, with regulating the number and the location, the licenses, all of that. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. OHA really is really in control of all of it. The board is simply to make the recommendations based on what the voters adopted in the measure. But there is a little bit of a worry because, and Catherine, you can speak to the legality of this, but some counties and cities have potentially some voice in regulating if there are service centers, how their service centers, where they're located. There's some yes, you can't be near a school. There's definitely some hard nose, but other than that, it's interest, and it's not a small task to consider opening a service center. It's probably the most complicated part of the whole process, with a lot of risk. But I would, if it's something you are interested in, I would definitely try to get a pulse for what's going on in your local government. And go ahead.
I mean, I'll just jump in. It is true that this law allows counties to opt out. Now, we haven't heard if any counties are intending to opt out, but there is a mechanism to opt out. And then, as Steph was saying, this law is very heavily regulatory, and it's more than 70 pages long, and it has a lot of deep detail about where a facilitation center can be sited. And so these all fall under the umbrella of land use considerations. And, my colleague at Emerge, that is our land use legal beagle, is fielding those questions already from prospective service center operators. So yes, you need to take a really careful land use analysis before you buy your property on which you might site the retreat center. But there has been a lot of interest. I mean, certainly at Emerge, my colleague Dave Kopelak at that firm was the principal author of the measure. So we've had kind of an unusual number of prospective client inquiries. There are service centers being imagined all across the state. So my sense is that there's a lot of excitement about building out service centers and offering kind of spa-like retreat center services. But I think also we're just going to see a huge variety. We'll probably see existing offices that provide some sort of patient care of a variety of kinds, try to build out an additional capacity. But yeah, I think for those of you on this call who might be prospective service center operators, it's not too early to be making your site assessments and land use assessments and investigations. Yes, and I see the question in the chat. I mean, the same problems that present for businesses in the cannabis arena around cash and tax and these kinds of things will present in this arena as well, which is also why, and when I was introduced, it was mentioned that I'm with the Psychedelic Bar Association. This is a new bar association that just launched in the last year for attorneys that want to practice in the psychedelic domain. And what we are seeing is that a high percent of the attorneys that intend to practice in the psychedelic arena have experience in the cannabis industry. And it's because the familiarity with how do you conduct a business, which has been made legal by state law, but remains illegal under federal law. There are a lot of complex considerations. And so hence the cannabis lawyers are now repurposing a part of their work into the psychedelic work.
So there was a question just before that too about psilocybin being removed from Schedule 1 status. Would you or Steph be able to speak to that, kind of what the status
Well,
is?
I mean, I'll jump right on that because I think we did file the first ever petition to reschedule psilocybin off of Schedule 1 onto Schedule 2 that has been presented ever to the DEA. And we filed that on February 2nd. It's up on the Emerge Law Group blog if you want to take a look at it. We've had no response from the DEA, even to acknowledge receipt of the petition. So we have then filed a federal request for information, FOIA request, to find out what is DEA doing with that petition. And we just have had a response on the FOIA request saying, this is too complicated to be answered in the near term. We'll get back to you at some undetermined point in the future. So we are pressing forward to compel the DEA to do its job, either to open a pathway under right to try or to reschedule psilocybin off of Schedule 1. The same day that we filed our rescheduling petition, on the very excellent podcast that Ethan Nadelman hosts called Psychoactive, Matthew Johnson, one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins, was his guest. And in his interview, he said placement of psilocybin on Schedule 1 is absurd. And so I think that's quite a widely held view in the research community. And it is time to see that rescheduled. And yet rescheduling takes typically, cannabis rescheduling petitions have been pending for more than 50 years.
Wow. So there's a couple more questions in the chat. I just want to briefly address that we're coming up on 5:30. We're going to keep the discussion going. We understand that many of you may need to depart, but we will stay on for the next 15 minutes or so just to keep the discussion going. So you're welcome to stay with us. If you have to go, the recording will be sent out to you and you can catch up on this tail end. I have a quick question before we go back to the chat for Lady Bird, the study that you're doing with healthcare providers, and just wondering how you're finding healthcare doctors and nurses to participate, and if somebody was interested in being a part of the study who is a healthcare provider, how they might find out about that.
Actually, thank you for asking. There is a link. We are looking for participants, especially participants of color. It's really hard to get people of color, understandably, because historically what's gone on with psychedelics and illegal medications and being involved in that, and also just in terms of access and where people work and people feeling like they have time to explore something like this. But Dr. Bach is actually coming to Oregon next week to do some public speaking about this study. And I think
Elizabeth, I
Elizabeth, are you
think
gonna?
was
I
going to
can
put it
post.
in the
Actually, I
chat.
can post it again too.
Okay.
Where's
Oh,
the
there,
picture?
Elizabeth just
I just
put it up.
Okay,
reposted
great.
it
If
Yeah.
you click on that link, it'll show you how to apply for the study. So we are still actively recruiting, and it would be fantastic. Usually the holdup is just scheduling because everybody's working and they have to be able to come for a full day. And we do offer 2 preparatory sessions. So there's a lot of preparation that goes into understanding why they're there and how we're going to support them. And then 3 integration sessions afterwards. So there is quite a bit of scheduling, but
And that all is taking place out in Seattle or outside of Seattle, so someone would need to travel.
the session definitely, and 1 pre-session and the first integration session all need to be in person. So just sort of the week before, the weekend, and the week after that
Okay.
window of time needs to be in person, but everything else we're actually doing on Zoom.
Okay,
So yeah.
great. That's helpful. Thanks so much for
Yeah,
sharing.
no, thanks for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. I know as a nurse, and Steph probably knows some nurses, we all probably know nurses and physicians who have experienced a lot.
Yeah,
So I think it's great that we have that available.
it's a wonderful thing. Thanks.
Yeah, and Lady Bird, I do really want to echo what you said earlier too, about just not just the symptomology, but really talking about just this talking and validating the distress and how valuable that is. And particularly with the prospect of having a terminal diagnosis and all the emotions that come along with that, with or without psychedelics, having someone to hold space and validating and giving voice of the sadness and the anger and the distress is valuable. So I appreciate that. Shout out to you.
I think about it also in terms of just the othering that we tend to do in the medical community, you know, having worked in hospice so long, and then hospice workers become these sort of magical beings that are witnessing or supporting this element of human life. And sometimes I notice that the patients and the clients would be almost smothered by us, you know, smothered by being hospiced and supporting them and doing all this stuff. And so I over the years really felt like there was such a need for people to back up, but not disappear, but get larger. And psychedelics are just so perfect for that. So it's like a moment in time where we can actually shift our model of how we alleviate suffering, as opposed to, oh, we just need one more medication or a different medication, or, you know, it's like, oh, actually this is offering us total evolutionary jump. So it's kind of exciting. Very exciting.
Yeah, yeah. So just to switch gears just a little bit, there's a great question that I think a lot of people might have on their minds, is just looking at how we're using this and the relief of symptoms, even though we're not looking specifically at symptom management. But someone has asked if it can be used as an alternative to morphine. Anyone want to comment? Steph or Lady Bird want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, we know that people who are depressed experience pain differently, and people are extremely anxious experience pain differently. And in hospice, we tend to not use the word pain, but we use discomfort, and we treat discomfort with psychotropics and opioids. And really a big reason I'm in this is I think there are other ways to support distress and discomfort. And it doesn't have to be out of anamorphine. And if you've been in this field, out of anamorphine, we do a lot of that. And I think, yes, potentially, maybe not completely in place. I mean, it depends on what the diagnosis is, but perhaps a lot less. I think there's pretty profound. It's quite curious, and I'm very hopeful.
Great, thank you. Lady Bird, anything to add? No.
No, I think I just agree with that. I agree
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah, I mean,
It's really well said.
yeah, as someone who worked in hospice for many years as well, I think you're spot on that we tend to just, well, I think, you know, healthcare providers tend to go with what they know and what they have in their toolbox, right? And we tend to just like, okay, well, this is what I've got. You're in pain, you're anxious. Okay, this is what I've got to help that. And it's that fixing or helping, right? Like, well, I got to fix this, I got to help this. Instead of, as Ladybird was saying earlier, instead of just creating a space and an opportunity to experience what that is. And if there's an expansion in that experience that's available, that's a real promise that then could potentially decrease the use of Ativan and morphine, right? And addressing
Yeah.
the underlying causes of the anxiety and pain versus just putting the Band-Aid on it.
Right, and doing a both and, right? It's like not like one or
Right.
the other. Like we also don't want to be, it's very hard to look at anything when we're in a lot of pain. So that has an
Yes.
element as well. But I think that element too, though, of the practitioners being able to access their own distress, you know, I think from my experience at least, patients go as far as clinicians are comfortable going. So it doesn't really, it matters that they can take the psychedelic, but if the space around them is not able to hold the places that person wants to go, then they're going to be guided towards where the clinician is comfortable. Versus the model with shamans is it wasn't about them.
Right.
They were trained and practiced to hold space for all of it, and the person got to go where they needed to go. But the model now is really much more clinician directed. And so it'll be curious to see what those trainings look like.
Yeah.
To
I see that there's a question, Steph, in the that you might be able to address about, and I don't know if this is something that is coming up in the OHA, but what a person would expect if they were signing up for a session, you know, for a therapy session. You know, is it prescribed how many sessions there are? You know, in terms of the pre-session and the integration and the actual, is that all prescribed by the OHA law? What could people expect?
Right. Well, I mean, the actual, the bare bones of the measure is a prep session that has to happen, and then the administration session. And service centers and facilitators will decide if there's more. And I hope, working with individuals and determining what their needs are, I see this to be a collaborative process where the person may come in with their therapist if they have one, or potentially, you know, not alone, with a family member. But that will really depend on the service center and a little bit about the rules and how that's set up. So I think you're going to find a lot of variability, though, between service centers and how they roll that out and what they require. But the very minimum is one prep, one administration, and then integration offered. But the clients don't have to partake in that. And how that's paid for, it will be determined. You know, the service centers will set their fees too. And there certainly are some service centers that are already looking at alternative payment models and lower access and opening access, actually, and having scholarships and grants that make it a little bit more affordable. Can I fully answer that?
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, I wanted to just pop in and say, with regard to the question, how many sessions are there? Steph is absolutely right that there's the prep, the administration, and an offered integration session. But it's not understood that patients come back again and again and again for this therapy. And one of the really interesting findings in these clinical trials is even a single guided session followed by integration brings relief. It's not that the patient needs a course of treatment where they come back repeatedly. And so I think that's another really exciting thing about it. Something happens during the experience that brings relief, and that relief is sustained and enduring. And that's really exciting.
And I think I might just chime in and totally agree. And I also hope that there is space for meaning making, that it's ongoing. And I think I agree. Some people absolutely have that one time great relief. It's all good. But I think there also will be people who maybe don't need more psilocybin, but need more support in unpacking and understanding and processing and what they do with what happened. And that could be with a therapist. And I don't think therapists hold the market on this. I think it could be with any number of intuitive, trained, skilled people.
Yeah, therapists are sometimes not the ones to do it, for sure, in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of so pre-programmed outside of those other areas that you have to deprogram.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing. It's the talk, and this is different.
So another question, I think we have just maybe two more questions, but one came up and it's around residency and being, what are the requirements about being a resident, how that's defined and maybe how that compares to what we, now we just now have medical aid in dying removing the residency requirement. So maybe
Right.
Catherine wants to talk
Yeah,
about.
well, I mean, of course, for the reason why, so as you may know, in the Oregon Death with Dignity Act passed in 1994, there was a restriction on service to residents of the state. That was not challenged for like 25 years, but it finally was challenged last year, and the state immediately caved, recognizing that, of course, that was not a proper barrier. It is not permissible to restrict services to residents. So there's no limitation to residents in the state. Residents can, visitors from other states can come to Oregon to receive psilocybin services, and I'm sure they will. I think that the excitement among prospective facilitation centers is to see people come in from out of state to participate. And I think that that will happen.
You do need to be an Oregon resident to become a facilitator, though. It's 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a requirement.
I want to bring up this last question here before we kind of close out, because I think it's a really interesting question about why the testing is going on with just one type of mushroom when there's so many available. Why are they just, it sounded like maybe they're just growing the one, just testing the one. And then it says, what would the dosage of a treatment be? I'm not sure if anybody can answer that, but maybe talking to why they're just using the one.
So there is so much that goes into trying to keep this safe. And OHA is an ORLAP, and they will be the one required. And there's a lot of nuance. And so to keep things more simple, and cubensis has, from what I understand, the most understood is most understood scientifically. And at some point, and that's super controversial, a lot of people have their favorites and they want to see other species grown, and that may happen in the future. But for now, it's just to keep it as simple as possible. And even at that, it's not. It's pretty daunting, actually.
Okay.
Is there a second part of that?
The second part was just what would the dosage of a treatment be?
Right. Well, stay tuned. That should be that it will be part of what's released. And I hope, Elizabeth, if you posted the OHA psilocybin, there's a whole service center webpage with lots of links on it It's still being developed, but when those final rules are posted here in the next week or so, it should list what the dosages are. And there'll be likely serving sizes that you could take up to. You could always take less, and you could probably have a second dose too, but that will be laid out. And it'll be similar to what's being done in research currently, with really that decision, that determination will be made between the facilitator and the client when they meet in the preparatory session based on their goals and why they're there, and their screening and what they want from it and their experiences and in the past and whatnot.
Okay, great. So we'll I just want to let everybody know we'll share all the links that have been mentioned this afternoon in that we've already put in the chat, but we'll include those in a follow-up email with a link to the recording as well. So I think we're coming up on 5:45, so I think we will go ahead and wrap up here. I just want to quickly share a couple more slides. After, first of all, thanking our panelists this evening, Catherine Tucker, Steph Bars, and Lady Bird Morgan, for really sharing such valuable information about this topic. We just so appreciate that you participated and really put this information out to folks who are interested and beyond. So, Catherine, I'm going to share my screen so that you can talk a little bit about the upcoming, for those folks who are interested in more information, you can talk a little bit about this event.
Yeah, so this dovetails really nicely for anyone on this call who wants to hear more, and not so much from me. I'm really just going to be a fly on the wall. But we've got a couple of incredibly highly experienced speakers. The former chief of staff from the DEA, Jody Avergan. She's also a former chief of DOJ in dangerous drug enforcement, and a former prosecuting attorney, an assistant United States attorney. She will be one of our speakers to kind of speculate on what we might imagine DEA and DOJ are thinking about the Oregon statute and what posture the federal government will take vis-a-vis operation of Oregon's law. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from her. And then Billy Williams, you may know, as the former U.S. attorney, assistant United States attorney in Oregon. He was in office for many of the years of cannabis becoming legal in Oregon and yet remaining illegal under federal law. And so he can comment also from that experience in that state. And then we have a DEA registrant, a physician with Providence, who provides end-of-life care, who is willing to come on and kind of flag the issues of concern she has when she thinks about meeting the needs of her patients who might benefit from this therapy. So I think we're going to have a really interesting, these are free webinars. They're scheduled to go for 2 hours from 4 to 6. So I hope any of you that didn't get enough of the legal drill down will join us for that. And I think you do need to register, but there isn't a charge, and love to see as many of you there as can join.
Thank you, Catherine. And finally, we put the link in the chat for that event. And then finally, we just want to thank you and remind you that as a nonprofit organization, we rely on donors and grant funding to do the work that we do. On September 11th of this year, we'll be hosting our annual fundraiser here in Bend with great food, great music, storytelling about the work that we do. It's the biggest fundraising activity we have of the year, and helps raise funds to allow us to continue our mission and bring our education, our planning, and our presence to individuals and families with serious and terminal illness, especially members of our community who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford the additional support that we can provide as an organization. We welcome auction and raffle donors, and event volunteers as well, especially if you have an OLCC license. So you can see our contact information here. If you're available or interested, sign up for our newsletter at thepeacefulpresenceproject.org on the contact page, or reach out to us, info@thepeacefulpresenceproject.org. And we look forward to engaging with you more in the future. And again, thank you for being a part of this, this great discussion. And we will hopefully see you again in the future. Thank you, everyone, so much. Lots of